horniness has been a survival mechanism since black enslaved people were kidnapped in the name of progress and brought to the New World, which was really a very old world for the native peoples living here for centuries. Enslaved black people who were maimed and annihilated in the Middle Passage and worked like beasts of burden in the peculiar institution and still produced black genius.
Thank you for being here. My welcome begins with Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving for nourishing rain. And Thanksgiving that the predictions have it ending in the middle of tonight. Thanksgiving for our co-host in this event, these two quite amazing churches. Thanksgiving for the Lowell Institute, which has funded this lecture, made it possible for us to gather together, not only to learn what's here, but to learn what's deep down.
So the title of the lecture, as you may have seen, is Shadowboxing the Ridiculous. And the subtitle is, or what does good theological education look like? Shadowboxing the Ridiculous, or what does good theological education look like? I want to dedicate tonight's lecture to two people, to the memory and spirit of not only Katie Cannon, who was my mentor and the one who pushed me back to school to get my PhD and go out and teach, but also Gail O'Day, and then you may not know as well, who was the dean of Wake Forest Divinity School until late last year when she had to resign because a brain tumor was having its way. Gail died this past Sunday. And she, too, was a force of nature. So may both their passions continue to live in us. About a year or so ago, I introduced my colleague Danielle Pott to the Black Martinican writer Patrick Chomazeau and his powerful novel Texaco. Chomazeau writes in a powerful blend of French and Creole in his novels, and not enough of them have been translated into English. I suspect that this is because it is hard to capture his free-form use of the French language in English, as his highly complex and fluid mixture of Creolism blends sentences and creates stunning word pictures that linger in the imagination. Danielle was so taken with Chomazeau in English that he began reading his untranslated work and discovered his novel, Un Dimanche à Chapeau, Roman, or translated into English, roughly a Sunday at the Dungeon, a novel. Daniel translated a passage that he thought captured the novel and that I would find compelling. In his contextualization, Daniel explains, these notes are Chomazeau's effort of summarizing what he needs to describe in the next 150 pages of his novel. His storytelling to a traumatized girl who had been repeatedly raped and who had been brought to a youth center organized on what was a plantation, who took instinctively refuge there in a chateau, in which slaves were locked up until death as a punishment and lesson for other slaves. To help the young girl, Chomazeau tells her the story of a slave who ended up at this same place. These notes interrupt the novel, which resumes on the next page and becomes a haunting presentation of the experience of being a slave or slaves. But these notes summarize what Chamisso tries and does so powerfully to do in the rest of the novel. And here's Danielle's translation. Notes. They are hundreds who are surviving like this, without being hit, without wounds, who even escape the whip, just half invisible in this inexistence, submitted to a slow, daily, invisible body blow, fed by false directives, body blow that very often does not draw blood, apparently not hurtful. And yet, this is what makes out of this repeated body blow the worst of cruelty. I spoke with the master. He is a god, since he has absolute power of life and death upon hundreds of creatures. He does not merely have this power, but he uses it almost without being aware that he is doing it. He has become inhuman. The more so because he believes that having this power is legitimate, without boundaries, without limitations. It is a right that he appropriated for himself. It is a certitude that he built for himself. Ever fearful to be inhuman? The human is outrageous, and it is this outrageousness that the inhuman is located. Ever fearful in order to live this outrageousness without risk. And I saw those who suffer under his yoke. Even without whip, without torture, they have to live with the awareness that any day, any time, without rhyme or reason, even because of a most insignificant thing, their immutable and even irredeemable vocation is to be sacrificed. To live like this is extreme barbary. We have to admit it. Horror does not need any blood, any spectacular torture or carnage. The most extreme horror can also be a daily affair, emotionless, motionless, in which the human can no longer imagine him or herself as human. The end of the translation. Rather than outrageous, the word ridiculous came to mind as I sat with Danielle's translation. I have long believed that discrimination and hatred are ridiculous, not because they make no sense, but because we often try to make them sensible, rational, some angle of vision that passes for reality or for what is true, so that we can ignore the worlds and peoples around us that contradict what we have decided are less than, inferior, the objects of extreme disdain, or violent tiki torches, or gas chambers, or lynching trees, or armed border crossings, or banking concept classrooms. Ridiculous, meaning shocking, meaning outrageous, meaning indecent. In the South and South Midland, according to the Dictionary of American Religious English, had to go find some proof for what I was getting at. These meanings are so much more precise than the standard text about ridiculous, where it is deserving or inviting derision or mockery, absurd, causing or worthy of ridicule or derision, preposterous, laughable, foolish, or unreasonable, and deserving to be laughed at. To a Southern girl, now a Southern woman, seeing and living the ridiculous as shocking or outrageous or indecent resonates in a deep Southern moan way that says something about how we learn and how we listen and how we process the teaching moment the learning moment, and then decide whether or not to let it in or throw it out like bad breath or a rotten fish in the midst of the storm of creation, gone into arcane whams and shudders. To survive and thrive in these troubling times, I ask that you think with me in this three-frame activity of the shocking, the outrageous, and the indecent. For we are never far from the note-taker's reminder of the ridiculous. Is outrageous. Remember, he says, we have to admit it, horror does not need any blood, any spectacular torture or carnage. The most extreme horror can also be a daily affair, emotionless, motionless, in which the human can no longer imagine him or herself as human. So we begin with the shocking. No longer imagine him or herself as human, or not imagine others as human. I grew up in a world where black folk were smart, dumb, wise, foolish, holy, profane, healthy, sickly, old, young, storytellers, jokesters, punsters, and willing to be a good audience for those who practice the fine art of communication in an idea or bending a sentence. I learned early that education, black education, was far more precious than money and more lasting than physical property. Getting an education, and a good one, was the key to that thing we were taught was called the future. Yes, it was that little predominantly black trans-class neighborhood of tobacco factory workers, nurses, policemen, grade school teachers, secretaries, college professors, day laborers, insurance executives, lawyers, doctors, and even a house of ill repute that the women who lived in it called home. It was that neighborhood that bred a kind of organic inquisitiveness, where I had the first inklings of what learning and then later scholarship can and must do when it is made available to a wider pool of folks, rather than remain cosseted in the hands of those who see education as a possession, rather than as a gift and birthright in a stumbling democracy such as ours. This organic inquisitiveness led me to wonder how we will engage teaching religion in societies that have often been trained to see the religious as trite, conservative, mean, narrow, violent, and vindictive. In the lives of women, darker-skinned folk, folk that resist a cishet norm, and others are herded into an essentialist swamp that circumscribes our thought with modifiers such as black or queer or southern to keep us off of the intellectual playing field of big ideas and scholarly discourses, or away from church leadership because we represent micro thoughts, micro methodologies, micro analysis, interesting ideas, and unholy calling. It is a wearying form of shocking that what passes for markers of excellence in our classrooms, our scholarship, and our research, and that is still too white, too Christian, and too middle class, and too straight, and too unreflective about who is not being invited to the table, be it as colleagues or students or administrators or church councils. With all the decentering and speaking from the margins that has been going on for decades now, it seems that we have made some strategic dents in this thick armor, but simply not enough. And we should all check our methodological nerve and consider how those of us in theological education can keep our scholarship from devolving into an endgame of abstract urbanity that fails to have a public face in a society that needs to hear our scholarship in ways that can help us all as citizens or residents in a republic like the U.S. understand the rich plethora of religiosity that the world has, and the different voices that express it, have memories about it, may be able to provide new insights about our flawed humanity that yearns for better and not content itself with stereotypes, demonarchy, war games, and plumb foolishness when it comes to understanding the worlds we may inhabit and those of others. So I turn to outrageous. You know, this stuff matters because it builds toward a more just future and a more rigorous and adept body of scholarship and ministerial swag that are forged in excellence and not protecting one's scholarly or ministerial derriere. Theological worlds are vast and contain multitudes, and we must open the doors of programs and religious houses and so that a widening variety of interlocutors and resources may have their say. We must decide they are relevant or not, but to foreclose the conversation is bad pedagogy, suspect scholarship, and cowardly discipleship. And it signals to all students and believers that intellectual inquiry is not truly free, and exploring the vastness of God's creation has yield signs and stop signs when peering into the mysteries of creation. So we put up scholarly blinders that are employed so that when we're seeking admittance into the guild, or we slide into a sneering elitism about who can possibly be called to ministry, we do so with such ease and such purpose and such deadly, deadly precision. We should not encourage our students to become talking minor birds of nonsense or parishioners into see no evil, hear no evil, do no evil, mannequins of deceit. To become like those who think being anti-multilingual or cultural is a sign of patriotism and pride rather than jingoism and spit. Those folks, like folks who can only talk to each other, live lives in arrogant disdain and dismal ignorance. And we, are dangerous because we champion the notion that being magnificently ignorant of other cultures and worlds and worldviews is actually being smart and well-read or spiritual or presidential. So, if we are teachers of all stripes, we must nurture passion and precision in our teaching and realize that we should not train students to be the dipsticks for intellectual hubris, or encourage those who are entering other forms of ministry to be the plumb line for narcissistic theological dread. We must cultivate students who refuse to perform a classist, heteronormative, racist, sexist drag show and resist accepting minstrelsy as rigorous scholarship and or faith. The cultivation I am talking about or advocating for is built on an integrative move that represents the complexity of our isness, ought-ness, and could-be-ness in a complex sociocultural and political creation rimmed with theological, and more theological spirit. For many of us in this room and throughout the whole of the academy and religious communities, we've been told to live in split, if not fractured bodies and minds, to deny what interests us, to treat our ideas as suspect or folklorish or both, if not worse. And sometimes we have been told this in rigorous intellectual and spiritual exchange. We must combat encouraging the formation of students and parishioners who believe this kind of self-annihilation and demonic shape dance are markers of excellence or deep thoughts or the Holy Spirit. You see, just because folks who think darker-skinned people are a sea of wanton colored pathologies in suits and ties and dresses with pumps and pearls are threatening not to sit beside us in a scholarly pew or mourner's bench that are little more than postmodern auction box, we should never let this outrage prevent us from continuing to look for spaces, faithfully, methodologically, and theologically, to understand that there is no hiding place for exploring the worlds of the religious and savoring the spiritual. I believe that those of us who are professors must cultivate students who are clear that whatever else they may be doing in their lives, they are a body of fierce signification, who realize that it is a good thing to be among those folks who do not seem to fit into the idealized and pristine visions of the status quo. We must build a new, fresh, and healthy academy and church that values crafting a community of scholars and teachers and learners and disciples, who get excited when we translate our work from the library to the classroom, to study, to community, to home, to religious bodies, and back and beyond. We are doing the work our souls and intellects must have to stop a fantastic hegemonic imagination that circumscribes learning into narrow, constricting casings placed within an evil matrix of racism, sexism, classism, transism, militarism, ageism, and just about any other ism you can name. And then has the nerve to say that it is orthodox, when it really is a robust fear of change and the new in the ways we think and how we ask questions and offer answers. Excellent theological education should not produce scholarship of death and destruction that is so terrified of the complexity of existence that it shapes answers even before hearing the questions. It crafts reading lists that look like the high side of misery. It sanctions curricula that believes it's a good thing to segregate mind, body, and spirit. It rolls over and plays dead when faced with disasters, natural and human-made. It tries to respond to life and living, but spends too much time primping in front of funhouse mirrors of theorems and dicta. We do not need more people who believe and behave as if the world is a huge object lesson and a playground for us to test our ideas with no consequences, and as if doing so is either value-free or value-neutral. So I turn to the indecent. Somehow, we are moving towards a stance that a poorly educated public can sustain a vibrant democracy. Nothing can be further from the truth. For a vibrant democracy is built on the foundation of an informed and educated public. Part of what education must involve is the nature of things religious and how they affect our daily lives. The more capacious and understanding of religious worldviews, the better we understand the ways in which folks domestically and globally are responding to the world around them, their values, their cultures. And this is an important entry point for critical pedagogy that can and often does disrupt the traditional canons of theological thought. Folks, there's some people in here, usually called professors, sometimes called pastors, and also a few folks that just read a lot. who spent time, energy, and money mastering some of those canons with precision and nuance as interlocutors who often approach our work in ministry from a different pair of lenses that prompt different questions and use different resources that may be from conscious social locations, such as class or cultures or gender or race or sexualities or religion. Keep the list going. And yes, this has helped nudge the academic study of religion into the 21st century, kinda, while with the tradition in its grasp, but without allowing tradition to beget holified intellectual inertia. Today's world does not need pedagogies that are a threshing floor of arrogant or aloof scholarship and totally divorced from experience, that treat us as supporting players or interesting side chapters in the debates within our disciplines or in our religious bodies. We cannot underestimate the value of these things in a globalizing society like the US, where we have tended to be uneducated about other peoples and cultures. And we have not done a good job, as we should, internally, as we often merely stereotype each other as citizens of this republic. You see, we are a part of the formation of citizenships. Yes, even in theological education. And a key piece of the foundation for this, after developing a rigorous pedagogy, excellent colleagues, intellectual resources that help stretch talent, curricula, and are designed to address the concerns people must address in the church 21st century, and even as, not mundane but real, student funding, is that we must do so with eyes, minds, and hearts finely tuned to building a more incisive future that must be done in an atmosphere of learning and collegiality. This may be more pressing for folks of color or anyone who is not a card-carrying elite, who may be the only one or one of a few who look like them, have similar sets of shared experience, share similar cultural codings, and may be questioning the absence of theological thought that reflects the religious worlds in which they are raised and may continue to provide them sustenance. Now let me hasten to say, especially for those of you who are PhD students in here, it is important to learn the tradition, if not accepted canon of one's discipline, or the doctrines or basic tenets of one's denomination. Because you cannot innovate or transform what you do not know. But we must not be shackled by intellectual hauteur that disdains or mocks new modes of inquiry or new methodological musings or different resources, or stand behind a microphone after committing sermonic malpractice with the defense that the Lord told me to say. We better duck and watch for lightning bolts when we engage in these indecent acts. You see, I believe that cultivating a vibrant community of hope means we encourage one another to step out on the rim bones of nothingness and bring new worlds into being while insisting that those old worlds that shape so many of us but have been left out of the common understanding of the intellectual or the academic or the spiritual should have a seat at the welcome table as well. We must hold ourselves accountable for creating an intellectual and spiritual atmosphere that puts the spunk and spark back into learning by reminding us that learning comes from a variety of sources. And for every time the academy fails to pay attention to this, or devalues this, or considers this trite or inconsequential, and every time we face an examining committee or a church council that is more worried about our clothes, our hair, our seminary, has the seminary ruined you? And do not ask us these simple questions. Do you know Jesus? And will you seek to make disciples in answering your call? The academy and the church lose more of our credibility and ability to speak meaningfully into the lives of others and to have anything more to contribute than foolishness, all gussied up with big words and incomprehensible concepts and a whoop you stole from somebody else's revival. I'm resisting moaning at this point. So let me end with some reflections on decentering dehumanization. To shadowbox with the ridiculous, the shocking, the outrageous, the indecent, is to engage in deep, passionate commitment to take on theological education by speaking out of a fierce determination to help others and ourselves imagine that black folk, queer folk, trans folk, poor folk, all folk who have been sidelined into the category of the other are human. In fact, we are very human, and we are intent, many of us, on building societies that do not think that arguing for just relationships for all is a pipe dream, a fantasy, or illusory. I do not think that the engaged isness I am arguing for can maintain the note-taker's distance in reporting the horror of dehumanization to the body, mind, and soul, or the carnage we inflict when we shuffle creativity into a swamp of unreasoning monologues that sound deep but are just as vapid as scary comb-overs and mindless tweets. But deadly, because they are the foot soldiers for the power of privilege and hegemony to shape our vision, control our mind, stifle our conversations, steal our resolve, and snatch our faith. Damn it, most of us are brilliantly fine humans, so rather than waste breath that I will need when I'm dying, trying to prove to people who think otherwise, I choose to focus my womanist eye in my remaining time on what it would mean to de-center dehumanization. It is crucial to remember that critical, engaged teaching and learning does not grow like topsy. It must develop the thick skin of ornery insistence that we have something to say and something to teach and something to preach. And no, we are not perfect, but we sure ain't institutional gangsters showing up the hot mess of a spirituality and spiritually inept intellectual Game of Thrones. Friends, it's hard to work. It's hard work to decenter dehumanization because it is like a demonic Watusi that finds its vibe from the drumbeat of a fantastic hegemonic imagination. But one way that I try to decenter dehumanization is by practicing the fine art of colored orneriness. Colored orneriness is a lived experience of faith and scholarship and teaching that is embodied in people and is found in the concrete context in which people live out our beliefs. It is grounded in the struggle for love and justice It takes on antagonistic either-or thinking as unhealthy in many places in our faith journeys, and urges us to live in the both-and of a deep, sometimes biblical, sometimes socio-political, sometimes just something, witness. It is an unwavering ripening into wholeness that brings others along with us. We must put on effective boxing gloves to combat the outright ridiculous notion that some of us are not fully human. That some forms of religiosity are more profound or more challenging or more helpful or more spiritual or more akin to what humans do when meaning making. That some folks are only intriguing holiday toys that are left unwrapped in the corner while the real business of theological mumbling is carried out in long, low, leisurely moans of witlessness. So I'm not talking about an ornery that is easily annoyed or angered. Not the ornery of having an irritable disposition, although some situations might call for it. Or the ornery of being cantankerous, despite how much I like the sound of the word when engaged in verbal play. The ornery I'm talking about this evening, this late afternoon, is when folks are difficult to deal with or control. And colored orneriness has been a survival mechanism since black enslaved people were kidnapped in the name of progress and brought to the New World, which was really a very old world for the native peoples living here for centuries. Enslaved black people who were maimed and annihilated in the Middle Passage and worked like beasts of burden in the peculiar institution and still produced black genius. And the inheritors of those folks are sitting right here, right now, and beyond these doors. And we have allies. Difficult to deal with because we constantly contest and dispute a fiendish status quo that finds its solace and structure in the dehumanization of people based on class or ethnicity or gender or race or sexuality, sexual orientation, or just because, and more. Difficult to deal with because sheer orneriness is sometimes the only thing that can keep dreams alive. Give us a creative edge. Help us craft effective strategies for justice making, social change. Gives us the strength and the courage to keep walking into our classrooms or committee meetings or sanctuary doors, and helps us keep our humor and sway with our swag, so that we have the good sense to celebrate even the smallest victories before we get back to work, and the balance of spirit to know that defeat is an opportunity to learn and grow and craft a better strategy or insight in the future. And not do it that way again, at least not immediately, if the timing was wrong. I am arguing, like James Baldwin, that we do our first works over rather than live and practice a scholarship or witness that specializes in being the do-wop pom-pom squad for the cultural production of evil and the ridiculous. We must do the work our souls and intellects must have to stop this fantastic hegemonic imagination that has us performing impossible physical and intellectual contortions that not even Cirque du Soleil can do. When we shadowbox with the ridiculous, we are choosing a colored orneriness that has an attitude as it crafts moral thoughts, strategies, and actions that are not terrified of the curve of our hips, the arch of our backs, the slow swing in our walks, the glide of our fingers, the fire in our eyes, the coil of our hair, the deep moans and shouts of our ecstasies, the bottomless wailing cries of our sorrows, the slow bend of our smiles, the precision of our minds, the sass of our talk, perfectly and imperfectly. We are not Chamizot's note-taker, and we imagine the human and the humane every day, and then work to make it so, allowing our minds, our hearts, our isness to shimmer with theological fabulousness. For our job is not to build the dungeon, but to allow the richness of insights and experiences beyond what we know and don't know to fill our scholarship with deeper meaning, to beget more piercing faithfulness in our ministries, to offer more questions than answers as we seek to be more relevant and strategic and faithful. So we create spaces that form a community of scholars and teachers and learners and administrators and layfolk and more, who are moving into a more vibrant, more life-bringing and giving, more welcoming, more humane, more alive with possibilities that shadowbox and shadowboxes the ridiculous with justice and hope. As the old black woman who raised me used to say about such things. Thank you.
Let me ask you, Dr. Townes, the agenda that you just laid out for theological education, and I know you're not limiting the concept of education to the Theological Academy. I know you're not doing that, but since we are at the School of Theology, how do you reconcile the need for that kind of decentering, of dehumanization, and the real desire, I think, among our students for that kind of environment and that kind of education? How do you square that with the structures of formation and the structures of job security, for that matter, that professors have to contend with when all of these structures of accountability for their survival and success are holding them accountable to guild structures that don't much care about the needs of students who are going out to face this world. And so we have a challenge where professors who are listening to you, wanting to do what you're asking us to do, wanting to do what we know our students need us to do, and then trying to do what we have to do to hold on to the very jobs that allow us to do it without letting the structure swallow our souls up whole. How do we make sense of that and deal with that reality?
First, and I'm very serious about this, prayer and fasting. If one does not center oneself on a daily basis to enter into the halls of whatever we're entering into, to face that day as reasonably centered as we can be, we can't do the work you're suggesting. That's the first thing that comes to mind. After that, what I tried to argue for is a respect for tradition without allowing tradition to kill us. In other words, you really do have to know some things in order to critique some things. And that seems like an of course, but I think you might be surprised at the number of folks who try to jump over into criticism and they don't quite know what they're talking about. And you may have heard them in your classes. Just a guess. To know the tradition also helps you learn how to be strategic. What is it that you must teach so that others can live? Now, I often like to say, well, the only thing ethicists really do is teach a form of anarchy. It's organized, but it's anarchy, because we're constantly asking the question, why? And at a certain point, there's not going to be an answer, and people get frustrated. And that's where God takes over, and we figure out how to follow God in the midst of that. But until we get to that place, we have to find in our teaching the way to be both disruptive, or as some folks like to say, deconstructive. You heard that term? But the harder work is also to be constructive. My partner is a systematic theologian, and she teaches a course on eschatology every once in a while. And every time she teaches that course, the students don't know what to do when they get to the utopia section. They can do the dystopia stuff, and I suspect that's true for many of you here. But thinking, what might that just future look like? And how we might get there, that becomes a much more difficult move. But we've got to, I think, within theological education, not train our students, but teach our students how to do both. And to be very good at it, good enough so that whenever folks leave this place, that is in some ways a safer space, sometimes, that they can then teach others. Because it's a lonely business if you're the only one, but if you teach some other folks and bring them along, it's a lot easier. Especially if you're going into parish ministry or church or community-based ministries. You can't do it alone. So I think both have. Both have. And try to have some fun and humor in the process. I just don't think it's a good idea to be serious all the time. Usually. Okay. Anyone else want to step up? You don't want me to start singing. I have many gifts, but that is not one of them.
I don't know, like, I'm already learning about academia. It's much about a lot of fluffy words I don't understand, and like you were saying, having to critique things and bring something new to the table. And I feel like so much of the groundbreaking things about womanism and women's theology is already kind of been said. So it's I don't know what's new, and I guess that comes over time. But what am I supposed to bring to the table?
I want you to go look in the mirror and say, hello, new. I encourage you to find the online video that the Presbyterians did for Katie Cannon winning the Educator of the Year or whatever award, in which she talks about how her mentor, Professor Bev Harrison, who was the first woman to call herself, as far as I know, a feminist ethicist, was her teacher was Katie's teacher at Union. And Bev kept telling her, would you stop writing about white people? Stop it. And she would give her papers that had the white folk in it, and Bev would hand them back and say, no, we got this already. We got all this stuff. You're regurgitating what we already know. And finally, Katie gave up and said, you mean you want me to talk about what I heard my mama and my grandmama and my aunts and the other women who helped raise me, what they talked about around the kitchen table? And Bev said yes. And Katie's response was, why is this white woman trying to kill me? It wasn't exactly what she said. I can't remember. But that idea. And then Katie pauses in the video and says, and when Bev says yes, that's exactly what. Because we don't have that. We don't know what those women say. And Katie just pauses in the video and says, nobody ever told me that what I heard all the time was gold. Look in the mirror. Look in the mirror. Your questions, your insights, your ability to look at things and go, that's what you're bringing. Don't worry about whether it's new or not. That's not the point. The point is they are yours. And that's what you have. That's what you bring with authenticity and fullness. And that's true for everybody in this room, wherever you sit in your own wonderful social location. You bring yourself. And too often, I find students try to be imposters in class. It doesn't work well. It looks strange. And I just, students at Vanderbilt know when I'm suspicious of them because I do the puppy dog roll when they start talking. Be yourself. It's a lot easier. And know that you're going to be learning this whole time and beyond. And trust that and cherish it. You'll be okay. Where in the South?
Memphis, Tennessee.
Hello, Memphis. Which part?
I was born in Sumter, South Carolina. I lived most of my life in Tennessee. And then I came to the beautiful North.
Or as some folks say, up south.
But coming to the beautiful North gave me the opportunity to meet folks like you and Carter Hayward and the great Harrison and Joan Martin and Kate Cannon and all the wonderful teachers that I've had in my life. And when you brought out Bev's name, and I got to thinking about Katie and where we are in the world today, and thinking about Bev's essay, The Power of Anger and the Work of Love. I think that I always need to hear more about that. Because as a woman, I was socialized to keep my anger down and to behave. And I want to misbehave in a way that's constructive.
I was raised, some of you heard part of this earlier today in the joint class. I was raised in Durham, North Carolina. Both my parents were college professors. And both of them were college administrators at the end of their career. And I was bound and determined not to go into the family business. That didn't work out real well. The only thing I can say is that Dad died, both my parents died before I became an administrator, but they did sort of smirk when I started teaching with abandon. One thing that both my parents taught me, Dad more by observation, because he wasn't a big talker at home. He talked outside the house. He was a big talker. And we didn't find out about this until he died, when all his friends would come to the house during the wake period, and, well, you know, your father told me that, and you know, and my sister and I are looking at each other, which Ross Towns are they talking about? So there you go. But Mom did talk about it some. My mother was the first black woman to get a PhD in molecular biology from the University of Michigan. She wouldn't talk about it much. Other than it was painful and lonely. That's about all she'd say about it. And there's a tape she made before she died, talking about that I haven't had the nerve yet to listen to. So I gotta do that before I lose the tape altogether. Mom taught me a lot about strategic anger. That you can be angry, but if it is not creative, it is not helpful. Bev's essay gets at some of that. Audre Lorde's famous essay gets at some of that. It's the notion that one must take strong emotion, whatever it looks like, and place it within a creative toolkit that doesn't just think about ourselves, which doesn't mean we're self-abnegating, but realizing and reminding us, and reminding me at least, I'll own it for myself, that I'm not in this world alone, and that what I do has ripple effects. Who else am I bringing along with me without their permission? That becomes key. So if I get angry, which I have been known to do, even in Dean's Council meetings, at vice chancellors, who to this day are afraid to be around me. Since I did, and it wasn't all that big. What I did, but they saw the anger, and that was all they took. Black women being angry towards white men is a very scary thing. But I was strategic because I knew he wasn't going to listen to me, but I knew my fellow deans would. I have their respect, I have their ear. And when I said something was unconscionable and he should be ashamed of himself, they heard it, even though I saw him put up the wall. And that was just fine, because this was not for him, it was for the rest of us. That we need to speak our minds when something really wrong is happening. That kind of anger, it almost doesn't come at a cost. Because I'm sort of watching myself in some ways be a trickster. I know full well I'm under complete control. Everybody in the room is afraid, else in the room might be afraid I'm going to blow up. But I'm not going to waste my energy on that. So finding ways to have creative anger that takes into account who else around you is going to be affected. And even imagine beyond, I think, for me at least, is a way to not tamp down emotions, because there's a reason why black folk have the highest levels of stress-related illnesses. We too often do tamp it down. And as I've said in other places, I want to be old when I die. That is the ultimate colored womanist ornery move. And more so as I'm losing friends right and left these days. Let's go over here and then we'll come back.
Thank you, Dr. Townes, for your wonderful speech. Your presentation and your remarks directly relates to the question that I want to ask about the cost, the toll, the psyche of being a Black, authentic person in the academy. I have my MDiv from the School of Theology and did my dissertation at the School of Education here. And someone who was a two-generation doctoral student said, write about yourself. And I'm glad that I did write about, being a minority in the higher education system. But as I think about Dale Andrews, when I heard he died, I cried. He was a mentor. Anthony Perrette, so many people who are Black pioneers, females and males in the academy, dying to me prematurely. What are words that individuals who choose to enter that space can do to guard their hearts, their souls, their physical and mental beings?
To be honest, a lot of us are looking over our shoulder. Many of us had time to prepare for Jim Cohn's death. He had been battling cancer for a number of years, and the latest flare-up we knew early on was going to be the last. So we had months. Dale discovered, well, his cancer was diagnosed in early December, and he was gone in June. His diagnosis was terminal, so we knew that. We thought he has 2 years max, so all of us sort of went into whatever denial we needed to say, well, knowing Dale, he'll go to the 2-year mark, if not beyond. That didn't happen. Katie got her diagnosis of acute leukemia June 6 or 7. She was gone August 8th. Acute leukemia for a 68-year-old is a death sentence. So we all knew that, but nobody thought it would be that soon. I've lost count of the friends I've lost in the last year and a half. I don't even want to go back and count them up because it's too devastating. I am a firm believer that forms of cancer, some forms of cancer, are stress-induced. And all people have pretty stressful lives. I have a stressful life. What does that mean for my longevity? The longevity of friends who have even more stressful lives than I do in the academy. It seems to me that we have to start sooner than any of us do with practicing real serious self-care. Losing weight, finding a spiritual practice that is consistent and daily. If it's not daily, you only get 1 miss a week. Something like that. And to try and realize what we teach is stressful, so how do we even that out? You know, for me, it would be, don't teach 2 hard classes in the same semester. Who am I proving? What am I proving? Nothing, really, other than I can get real tired. The students may love what they're getting, but at what cost? Not only to me, but to my family. And now that I'm married, and I have a little dog, or as we say, we have Winnie who masquerades as a dog. My 85-year-old aunt lives with us. She has Parkinson's. We've got a family going, and my sister's soon going to be moving to Nashville. We just keep expanding the tent. I've got responsibilities I need to take care of. I hope I have gotten my attention now to really try to develop practices that help me de-stress and not buy into my own perfectionism. Dale was working out. He had gotten I'm getting this weight off me. He started working out. He was doing well. And then he was tired and he couldn't figure. He thought maybe he was doing a little rigorous. No, it was cancer. Katie kept going. The first sign that something was wrong happened in November before she died. She didn't get it looked at until June. It was too late. We just have to pay attention to our bodies. Our bodies are talking to us before our minds listen. gotta get those two things going together. And then I think it's always important to tell the truth. That's not always easy to do in our scholarship, in our work, in our ministries, but we do have to tell the truth. It's a lot easier because then we don't have to remember the lies we told, which for me is more stressful. When did I say that?
Thank you so much.
Good evening, thank you, Dr. Townes. I'm Hazel, I'm a third-year MDiv at the School of Theology. So I'm in what I'm assuming you're considering my shadowboxing training as a theologian, as a seminarian. So I'm interested in your title for tonight, Shadowboxing, Ridiculous. At the risk of assuming what you mean, I just thought I should ask. Are you thinking about theological training as the shadowboxing to prepare us for like getting out in the real world to do the real boxing? Not to sound violent either.
Good question.
Honestly, I don't know.
Make something up.
I'm trying to remember where I came up with the title. And I can't. I'm sure it was in a conversation with someone. And we must have been talking, oh, I know what it was. Okay. My aunt, who has Parkinson's, takes boxing classes. This is a new therapy for Parkinson's patients. Because with Parkinson's, big movements slow down, it doesn't stop, but slows down the progression of the tremors. So she goes twice a week to her boxing class, where at 85 she is the youngest person in the room, except for their trainer, who is a physical therapist. My aunt is a little bitty thing. She's about 4 foot nothing. And well, I heard her weight the other day because she was we were at the doctor's office. She's 110 pounds. I mean, she's a little bit of nothing. So when she gets behind some of the punching bags, I can't see it. I know she's there because I can see her feet. And her teacher, her therapist, was teaching the class one day how to shadow box so that they could do exercises in between classes. And I was like, shadow boxing, huh? And I was starting to think about this lecture. This was from the spring. And I was reading Danielle's translation, and it all sort of came together. But as to theological education and what that means, I think you get to make the meaning out of that. Because I haven't gone that far yet. You know, what is it I do mean by this, other than what I've talked about tonight?
Thank you.
And this will have to be our last question.
Nikita McAllister, alumni from Boston University. I had a two-part question. I resonated with your sense of being honored, and meaning like I'm going to stick with this, I'm going to fight to the end. But as I look at you and others who have, Dr. Campbell, as Pauline has suggested, who have gone away, I feel like part of my assessment, personal, a part of being honorary is that you're dealing with the microaggressions of racism as well as sexism and how that gets internalized, and then there are health effects. So how do you come up with something that will sustain when that is still the majority problem that we have here in America? I mean, I think that's a huge part of what gets internalized.
Actually, I did it this morning too. I usually fall out of rhythm when I'm not at home. I start my day usually, especially once we get past daylight savings time, in darkness. I'm the first one who gets up. I get up around 5. I don't turn on the lights. And I go into our family room, which has a bank of windows that look west in Nashville. So I see the ridge. Nashville sits on a plain in a ridge, and so I can see, if it's clear, I can see the outline of the ridge. And I meditate. I start the day with meditation and silence. And recently I've been doing Insightful. There's an app called Insightful. And so I'm using music now. And I just try to get myself together. I find when I don't do that, it doesn't bode well for the day. I have I tolerate foolishness less, which is never a good thing for an administrator not to be able to tolerate. And I have a great faculty and staff and student body, but people will be people. So. I can't speak for the upper administration, but in the Divinity School, we're wonderful. But I find that time, that half an hour to an hour every day, as absolutely necessary to help me, because sometimes I'm working in my sleep, so I need some time to get some more rest, but to help me remember what's the important thing here. I can only fix so much, and I can hardly fix anything by myself. So it reminds me of my humanity. It gives me an opportunity to roll with the punches when the microaggressions happen, and they happen every day, even for a dean. I was telling a class once who didn't believe me that microaggressions happen to me. When you put people on pedestals, things poo on people. And so, I had a visitor in my office who wanted something from me, and another staff person had accompanied the visitor to introduce us so that this person could ask if I would help with a project. So I'm sitting in my own office, and I start to notice that the conversation is happening between the two of them and not me. And I'm the one that has some authority to say yay or nay. So I just sort of, I just watch it. And I thought, in a younger life, I would have gone, excuse me, no girlfriend. But it wasn't worth it. Knowing when you can center yourself, when those kinds of microaggressions set in, and the macro ones, which are almost easier to deal with every time. I don't have to fight that battle every time. I can let go. I can let somebody else handle it. And if nobody else handles it, I'm taking names. These are not people I can ride with when the going gets tough. Don't depend on them because it's not in them. And therefore, I don't. What happened? Well, what happened was a long time ago when they told you they don't have it. So you have to pay attention to those sorts of I also believe that it's good to laugh. It's good to dance. If I could sing, I would. I have dreams of singing like Aretha. Those are some of the most glorious dreams. I sound like crickets when I sing, but you know, have other things you do that feed your creativity. Look for new forms of music. I recently discovered the Pines of Rome Symphony by Respighi. Oh my God. Getting to that fourth movement, and I saw it performed in the Nashville Symphony, and they turned it into spectacle. The trumpets in the upper balconies and a chorus behind a screen you couldn't see. I mean, they did it up. It was the only time I have, in a symphony performance, jumped to my feet clapping after it was over. Keep bringing in the new that refreshes and renews. Because I'm still going to listen to Aretha. I'm still going to listen to Al Jarreau. I'm trying to learn how to listen to Nicki Minaj. But I think, you know, Monet is probably as far as I can. But keep the new coming. In other words, find something that makes you smile.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I just wanted to say that as a student, one of the things that I found that was lacking was a sense of joy. So having that sense of centering is important. And I think beyond that, as a pastor, that's the thing, that love and joy that you bring to your congregations, because, I mean, Christians are some of the grumpiest people I know. Which makes no sense. So I have to say thank you very much for being drawn forward.
Won't you join me in thanking Dr. Emilie